But yeah, so next up we have our second panelist, RavensDagger. Yeah, so great to have you on as well. I can't begin to, usually I like to like try to estimate like the word count at least of Alta, but you have
Oh
so many
boy.
stories that it's
It would be a serious pain in the butt to go through and check the word counts of every single story.
Raven, don't you have an end of year summary basically
I
every year?
do, I do.
Just add those
I
up.
was just thinking about it. Yeah, so I know that the past 4 years have been 1 million word years. But then the years before that, I wasn't keeping count as well. I didn't have as many Excel sheets or whatever. So uh, call it 5 million, maybe,
5 million.
published so far, and probably half that again just in drafts and like random stuff that we wouldn't necessarily count. So
Right. And it might not be like super like a real like it's a number that doesn't feel real. Humans are, like we don't really always have like a we can't picture 5 million
mhm.
apples, but that's a lot.
it's
That's a lot of words.
it's a lot of words. It's like 0.25 pirate abbas.
And yeah, just on, royalroad.com, you have 21 fictions. And I know you've been more active on spacebattles.net, right?
Mhm.
For it seems like a few more years before you got your start on Royal Road. And those are both really cool online communities that started with fan fiction for those of you listening who might not be familiar with those platforms. And could you tell us a little bit more about, what got you inspired to start writing and um
If we're talking about like writing in general, I think it's always just been something I wanted to do. From a relatively young age, I just genuinely enjoyed reading. I was a very voracious reader, and I always wanted to be the one writing the stories that I was reading, which I think that's a pretty common feeling for people that are like that like they enjoy reading. Oftentimes I'd read something and it'd be like, oh, I wanted this to go on for longer, or oh, what if this happened instead of that? And I'd always have these scenarios going on in my head, and eventually I started writing these down. I started off with fan fiction, different fandoms, trying this and that, which actually I think is a pretty decent way to start writing. It's a terrible way to start writing, but as far as experience goes, it's very good because you're trying to copy the style of different authors as you try and jump into different fandoms. So it gives you a lot of experience on that front. Eventually, sometime before COVID, in the before times, I decided, hey, I had a Patreon for fan stuff, but I wanted to take it more seriously. I wanted to be like a professional writer. So I decided, hey, I'm going to try my hand at like web serial properly. And I jumped onto Royal Road with a few stories that were original stories that I had already written. And that kind of grew slowly, a few people here and there. And eventually I came to where I am now. I don't think I'm a good example of a successful author in our niche, especially on the financial side of things. I'm very bad at monetization, but I do enjoy what I do for writing, and I think I have like a good head start when it comes to like a lot of like different creative artsy stuff. I like writing strange things, and that's one of the big joys I have with writing.
right. And I know you're, we don't see this a lot, but an interactive story, right?
Yeah, what are called quests or yeah, interactive stories.
Right. Yeah. And or did you have something else in mind when you mentioned like, hey, like I do try to do these creative things?
I quests are very interesting. They are an excellent exercise if you're an author who wants to learn how to write, especially if you want to learn how to write things that you weren't expecting you would have to write, because you don't have control necessarily over the plot of the story or the characters or whatever, depending on the format of the quest. And you generally have like a very short timetable between chapters. So you have to learn how to write quickly, and you have to learn how to write things that you're not necessarily planning, and you have to learn how to adapt very quickly. And I think that's like very valuable experience for a writer, to learn how to just write quickly and things that you're not expecting. So sit down right now, go, 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 go,
Mhm.
and think on your feet. And I know that's not how a lot of people would like to write,
Right.
but I find it very enjoyable to do that. it's more interactive on my end as well.
Yeah, so because web serial, like for example, in this, as we mentioned in our practice session room before this panel, this is a new digital age.
Mhm.
Web serials, they're, often serialized per chapter on a daily basis, maybe 2, 3 times a week, in rare cases monthly, and still find success. And I feel like this quest format adds even more, challenge, but also has some merits in that you're interacting with the readers and they're telling you like, hey, like this happens next, and then you're like,
It,
okay, like
it's web
like,
serials on hard mode basically,
I see.
but it's quite a bit of fun. But yeah, I tried to do a few of those. I just finished my latest one, Noble Bright. That one finished recently. I'm not sure if I'm going to do another one for a little while because they are quite draining. They're
Yeah,
quite taxing.
right. It's like the game that you might like. I used to play in like summer camp where like everyone sits in a circle, says a word, and then the next part like or says a sentence, and like we string together a story. That's how I imagine.
Yeah, a little bit.
So you're not never quite sure where it's gonna go. But yeah, it sounds like a fun and kind of like a good training, session. I feel like you might have mentioned in one of your AMAs that, you mentioned the story where a particular story, I think it was maybe Noble Bright or Past the Red Line, where you mentioned like, hey, this was like the first time where I was like, really actively trying to like improve certain parts of my writing craft. Was that a quest story or?
I think the like the story I mentioned in that AMA probably was Heart of Darkness,
Oh, right,
which
right.
is not my most popular story. The people who have read it, it has a very good rating for the people who have read it. So I know it's good in that sense. But that was one of the first stories where recently I sat down and I was like, okay, I can write competently, but competently is not perfectly. So I tried to really push myself into like
Hmm,
writing better plots and like
hmm,
do better.
right.
Because sometimes it's easy to become complacent with your own writing, your own art, where you kind of step back and it's like, okay, I'm doing a good enough, and good enough is good enough. But it's hard to remember that like good enough is not perfect, right? You can definitely always improve at something. So you get some feedback and you tell yourself, okay, I'm not good at this and that and the other thing, and then you don't always have the opportunity to practice something that allows you to fix that issue. But I'm a multi-story author, so I tend to, whenever I write a new story, I tend to focus on I have an issue writing this specific type of situation or this specific thing in writing. So I will plot my new story around the thing that I'm not good at so that I can practice that thing specifically.
Hmm,
So sometimes it's pacing issues. I've always had very difficult time with pacing. So I wrote a couple stories where the pacing was exceptionally fast, or I'm really bad at doing time skipping.
hmm,
So that's another thing where I wrote a story where, okay, well, now the story it's coded into the very plot of the story that
hmm,
the time has to move forward in like weeks and months.
hmm,
So just find out what you're not great at and then work on that thing specifically.
hmm. And I feel like that's one of the, pros of working on multiple stories, right? Because maybe if you were working on one long story, it's hard for you to like, okay, this chapter I'm gonna work on this issue, this chapter I'm gonna work on this issue, because I feel like I don't know, that might make it for a slightly disjointed.
I think you'd have that type of issue as well. Also, if you're writing one story, you're stuck to writing one style, more or less. You can do like an off chapter where it's like, oh, in this chapter, it's going to be this other style of writing. But I think Selkie's like a one story guy, right? He's got Beneath the Dragon Eye Moons. It's his big story. He could not pivot and say, "Hey, I'm going to write the entire next book as like a noir." It wouldn't work. He would have a lot of angry fans. Like he can't change the tense and say, "Hey, you know what? Dragon Eye Moons from now on present tense," just to practice it.
Yeah.
He can't change the person. Like I think it's in first person, right? He can't just be like, "It's gonna be in third from now on."
Right.
or second, or actually second is a weird one. But don't
So,
write
so
Dragon Eye Moons in second person, Saki, please.
yeah, so I just want to jump in real fast because my story's been quoted. The only thing I can do is when I change point of views, I can briefly for a single chapter experiment with other stuff. So I wrote a one character's point of view as a film noir in the third person, for example. But I have to be real careful about those because if I'm not careful with them, they're not very popular chapters. And people just really are like, we're here for Elaine. This is a character-driven story. Get back to, the actual character. I have tiny amounts of wiggle room, but as Raven said, I've got no true wiggle.
Yeah. So that is a disadvantage to writing a single big story. There are significant advantages to writing one big story. For example, the length of a story is a big contributor to whether or not people are going to want to read it. Especially on RoyalRoad and like web serials, people look for longer stories. And I have a couple of stories that are approaching 1 million words, but nothing that's past that yet. And I think if I had put all of my effort into writing just one story, it would be a massive, really long story, which in and of itself would attract a lot more readers. And in spaces like RoyalRoad, where your view count is directly attached to the number of chapters you have, a longer story with more chapters and more content means more views, which means more space on the front page, which means better odds for your story being seen by more people, which again means more views, and it kind of snowballs that way.
Right.
So there are significant advantages to being a one story person. It's just that I I really can't do that. My focus is too weak for just
Oh, no, yeah.
doing one thing.
I think that's a really good strength too, though, because one of my favorite authors is Isaac Asimov, who's a father of science fiction. I've read a
500 odd books. Yeah.
yeah, and that's how he used to work. He says like, hey, like if I'm working and I get bored of one story, I just hop on over to another story, and he's like one of the most prolific authors of
Mhm.
history, and I think maybe that has something to do with your own prolific likeness, maybe because so like I've talked to a few other authors who write multiple stories, and they've said like, hey, yeah, like 2 or 3 stories is like tends to be my limit, and then afterwards I find my quality to be suffering. But I feel like you've developed this brand, writing style, writing voice that works so well with the types of stories that you're writing, and then the fact that you are writing multiple stories. And I've also noticed, and I do want to ask you, like, for Fluff, for example, one of your stories that I love, the chapters are really short, and I feel like you're not like forcing yourself to write really long chapters. Maybe it's
I've
just that
I've
you're
run into that issue where a healthy chapter size for a web serial and a healthy chapter size for a properly published novel are not quite the same. Sometimes when I publish a novel like on Amazon or something, I've done it before where I'll just chop up the chapters and squish them together. So a 60 web novel chapters will become 20 normal novel chapters. I'll just squish them together. And other times I won't bother. But yeah, for me personally, the size of the chapters that I aim for is enough to write one concise, well written scene with like enough description and like here's a full scene of the story. Things have happened in the time that you're reading. Okay, that's a chapter. And then you go on to the next. So that averages out to between 1,500 to 2,000 words, which is a comfortable amount for me to write like 2 chapters like that every day. If I were writing purely for like traditional sake, I might not bother with shorter chapters. I would probably have 2 or 3 scenes like one after the other, and that does impact the writing. That does impact things. That changes your pacing because you're pacing your scenes to be not short but not too long either, and it also changes how much like how information dense each chapter is.
Mm.
So how much time you're giving yourself to describe things and characters and just having just pure character interaction. So I think that is also something to take into account if you're writing web serials specifically, as opposed to writing traditionally.
Mhm.
Because with the web serials, like you mentioned, people post a chapter a day. If you're posting a chapter a day, you need to be able to write a chapter a day, and that limits you to how long your chapters can be.
Right.
And if your chapters are shorter, well, then you need to write a plot that can be paced for shorter chapters. So it kind of has like a knock-on effect of each aspect of the web serial platform affecting how your story will end up in the end.
Awesome. Did you you mentioned, do you take that into account like when you're writing, like, hey, do you take into account like whether it's like outlining the plot, deciding on the themes, like do you think about the audience that you're writing for, the format that you're writing for, which is the web serial more?
I think it's important to take that into account before you start writing, because it'll obviously change your approach to writing any given story. I don't think you should use that as a limiting factor, however. You shouldn't say, "Oh, I can't write this type of story because it's a web serial."
Right.
I think there's ways around that. But at the same time, yes, it is something that you should definitely sit down and be like, "Ah, okay, I'm writing this type of story. It's not maybe not something that's very easy for web serials." I think there's a reason why so many web serials are progression fantasy, where it's very action oriented and like the story moves forward at like a fairly rapid pace.
Mhm.
I think the format pushes that forward. Also, because of the format, you're posting chapter. If you're posting a chapter a week or two chapters a week, you need to keep the reader's attention on your story. If you're not hooked on chapter 40 and you're bored halfway through it, you might not come back in 2 days to read chapter 41, right? So
Mhm.
each chapter needs to have something that keeps the reader wanting more.
Right.
And so that's a very different approach from a traditionally written story, where in a traditionally written story, there's a sunk cost for the reader. They've bought the book. If there's a boring chapter in the middle of it, it's it's not a big deal. They're going to flip the page to the next chapter. And if you have 3 or 4 boring chapters in a row, well, as long as they're developing the story in some way, it doesn't really matter as much. You can point to some of like fantasy's biggest, most famous books. The Wheel of Time comes to mind because it's a really egregious example of it. But there's like a couple of books in a row where there's just like a really long segment or long arcs that are just kind of dull, but we still read the entire series, or we'll keep on reading it because yes, there might be a big long 30,000 of nothing, like 30,000 words of nothing in the middle, but we know it's going to get to something, right? In a web serial, if you had 30,000 words of nothing, you would lose half your readers,
Right.
and you'd just be, your story would be dead in the water.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to take that into account in your plotting, in your writing, in your story building phase before you actually start writing. So I think that's kind of interesting. It changes your approach to writing overall just because of the medium.
Yeah, yeah, you meant like there's so many things, different considerations that you have to put into writing a web serial versus writing a traditional fiction work of fiction. There's different pros and cons. Yeah, so thank you for sharing your hard-earned insights with
No
us.
problem.
Yeah, let's see. Oh yeah. You know, speaking of so we've talked about a little bit about how to get into, you know, writing web serials and how it's become this over the past 3 5 years, this really competitive field because authors are finding a lot of success, and you are a very successful author in this field. You are, you know, your name is synonymous almost with the cozy fantasy and the lit RPG space, and so you've been able to like kind of like establish a niche for your strong niche for yourself.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm
Uh,
gonna start calling myself the father of cozy fantasy.
oh no,
No,
we've seen how some of that goes, right?
we've seen how that'll end up.
Raven, I showed you the grandfather of litRPG post. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great.
So let me see.
Yeah.
You've and I feel like and you mentioned you discussed this in your Crit RPG podcast, where people have this tendency to, in dark times, seek really uplifting, you know, cozy stories, and then maybe during times that are good, they might seek more of the thrilling drama kind of story. And maybe it speaks to the times that we're living in now that,
that that that
much.
cozy fantasies on the rise quite significantly. Yeah, times are not ideal for a lot of people right now, and things are a little bit dark, very dark for some people in some places. There's a lot of bad stuff going on, and I think those times are the times where it's most important for people to have a refuge from that kind of darkness. And cozier, lighter, fluffier stories can be that for a lot of people. They're not necessarily a distraction, but they're a way for people to have something softer to read, something cozy, something that makes them feel nice. And I'm very happy to be someone that can provide that. If my readers are happy from the stories that I've read, then I'm happy as well. Which is why I tend to angle more towards softer, fluffier, happier stories. I don't want to write darker, grim, dark kind of stuff because that's depressing, and it depresses me to write it. Also, I think you mentioned it with Selkie when you mentioned Discord communities. There's a community aspect to it as well, where I guess it's just a direct correlation. The type of story that attracts people that are happy and wholesome, or people that want that, tend to be wholesome stories, and then you get wholesome people around that. So your community ends up being a community of very nice, friendly people.
Yeah.
And that's great. Yeah, I'd much rather be surrounded by happy, nice people than dour, angry or whatever. So
Yeah.
I think that's important as well.
Yeah, and sorry, playing, but that's really in line with my own experience. And I think because I come from a background of, getting into Japanese light novels first, and then finding, I was a part of the Korean and Chinese web novel translation scene, which is in part how I found RoyalRoad, because it started off as a hosting one of the Korean web novels. But the one theme and in those kinds of stories is power fantasies and escapisms, and those are good. Those can be good stories sometimes, and maybe fantasy at its core is always a form of maybe not, but has some form of escapism going on.
A little bit, yeah.
And it can get really exhausting for a reader to read about, these stories that you have to kill something to gain, nothing wrong with that. I'm a huge fan of those kind of stories, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
right? But
I'm not against it. I've written my fair share of power fantasy stuff as well, and it's a lot of fun. I think it's a great background for comedy. It's a great backdrop for it's just ridiculous, fun, escapist, awesome fights and cool scenes. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that if that's what you're into, and I'm into it as well. It's hard to be in the RPG space without enjoying that kind of stuff, right? Like the entire idea of a litRPG system is very power fantasy. It's numbers going up. So I think it's hard to not enjoy that. At least for me.
Yeah. And I guess, just speaking from personal experience about and this is something like there's a little bit of a reader fatigue going on where maybe some people never get tired of, like they want more and more. And that's actually a hallmark of the RPG demographic and readers, right? Is they want more stories faster. And some of their complaints are like, hey, we don't have enough books to consume. But for some readers, maybe they want to read. They have like 2 or 3 genres that they really like. So for me, that would be lit RPG, but rational fiction as well, and then the wholesome comedy. So it was really refreshing for me to Fluff was the first book that I picked up by RavensDagger, and it was so refreshing and wholesome. And I think that's
thank you.
much needed in the space. So thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to open up the field to questions if anybody would like to hop on and ask any questions now.
We have a couple of written questions as well, if you feel like tackling those.
Of course. We'll let you share your minis. Raven is the first one, but you can maybe show them off.
Can I show? Will you show your minis? Yeah, sure. I was painting this morning. I got these itsy bitsy little broccolis. That I think that's why people are talking about minis, because
Right.
I commissioned someone to make these, and I gave out the printer files for people to pick up if they want. It's on my Patreon. It's free. It's on the public, and I'm painting them myself just for fun. But yeah, it's quite a bit of. I find it relaxing to paint small things. I don't know.
So we have another question from Riley. Says they're caught up on Agartha loop. Thank you for not making it Puella Magi Madoka Magica. Also,
Oh.
Selkie, no notes. Keep everything going as it is. And one for me. I don't know what you write, but I'd love to check it out. Maybe one day soon, I'll yeah, be able to share it more with the world, but maybe in an organic way where it makes its way up and
Yeah. So Puella Magi Madoka Magica is I probably mispronounced that. But it's this very I don't know if I want to use the word foundational, but it's like very important in the genre of magical girl stories.
right.
It was like a big deconstruction of the genre after the genre had not necessarily faded, but had become significantly less relevant and less popular. And it was written by people that like genuinely it felt like they loved the genre, but they wrote something that was like a rational deconstruction of it. Good art, good music, but like the story and everything, it took a lot of the things that were foundational to the genre and tried to explain them in a rational way. And it was very dark, as those kind of rational type stories tend to go. But yeah, it's quite a good piece of media. I strongly suggest it to people that are kind of into that.
Yeah. And I guess we didn't really get to touch on that either, but magical girls. You have
I have
Stray Cat Strut,
two.
kind of.
Sure Catch, I suppose, kind of counts.
Right.
It's got a little bit of that, a few tropes basically that are shared between it and the magical girl genre.
What is the magical girl genre and where did it kind of
Oh
start from?
boy.
Because you know that like the you mentioned like that the lit RPG started with like Russian authors first. So do you have a good grasp on? I feel like
I have a fairly good grasp on it. Obviously I missed like the early parts of it because that was before my time. Whereas the RPG is much younger as a genre, so everyone here is old enough to have been around when the when the genre started. Well, depending on how you define the first ones. But yeah, magical girl stories really started like 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Then you have like the really big stories that became very popular, stuff like Sailor Moon. They codified a lot of the tropes of the story from the more aesthetic tropes like animal companions that are magical type thing to transformation sequences and all that kind of stuff. It's a genre that I like a lot because of the tropes, not necessarily the aesthetic tropes, but the it has a lot of urban fantasy, which I enjoy. It has a lot of progression fantasy as well. Most of the time, the characters they have a magical power and they become more powerful as the series progresses, and they understand their powers and friendship and all this stuff. So there's that side of things. Motorcycle loves that, but also I enjoy the power up through friendship trope. It's just one of my favorites. It's just something I really enjoy, where characters become more powerful, not necessarily just because they're more powerful, but because they're working with others and they understand people around them. Just like that kind of social aspect to it that I genuinely understand, genuinely just enjoy that. And of course, like the self-empowering and like all this stuff. I kind of just I jive with it. I like it.
yeah. And I guess like yeah, like I mentioned like cozy fantasy, but you have so many different types of stories that deal with
Yeah, yeah. Cozy fantasy is fantastic though. I love the entire genre where it's fantasy tends to be emblematic with these big epic quests and like these huge adventures and fighting these big bads and everything. And those tend to be big stories. And I don't think fantasy needs to be about these huge, overwhelmingly big stories. You can have a big, like a good fantasy story that's about smaller things, right? You can have a fantasy story that's about running a bar, that's it. You
Mhm.
can have a fantasy story that's just like of one person who's deciding to, I'm going to become an adventurer or an explorer, and just doing like small things without having to challenge, some huge insurmountable foe. You don't need a Sauron in all of your stories. Basically, you can
Right.
you can have the focus be a lot smaller, down to earth, and with it comes this kind of cozy, wholesome, welcome, escapist vibe that I really enjoy. And I think judging by how many more people have joined that genre, I don't think I'm the only person that enjoys that kind of wholesome fantasy aspect to it.
Yeah, I agree. And as a reader, I'm very happy to be able to read a wide or a variety of
Yeah,
fictions. Yeah. So thank you for your time today and
yeah,
for
you're very
sharing
welcome.
hard-earned insights. We're going to take a 4-minute break, this time longer from our 2-minute break, and then get started with our final panelist. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy your break.
Alrighty.